Hey there, Matt here from the Frontline Coder. In this video, we'll go through how to set up a React application to run within Docker. I broke down the video into the most critical parts required to get it working. This is part one of a three-part series where I'll walk you through the process of getting a React application running inside Docker along with SSL and hot module reloading. We'll start off by creating a new React application. In this example, we'll use npx to download create React app. If you're using npm version 5.2 or above, you should automatically have this command available to you. We'll create a new React app named Docker HTTPS example, and we'll use TypeScript as a template. Now that all necessary packages have been downloaded, let's start up the app to make sure it's working. Okay, great. I can see the application is working great now, so let's move on and install Docker Desktop. You can search for Docker Desktop off Google, download the version that's appropriate for you, and when it's finished downloading, open it up and install it. First in our app, we'll create a new Docker Compose file, so new file, Docker Compose, and we'll put this file in the root directory of our project, and we'll use the YAML extension. This is the officially recommended extension. You can also, however, use YML. We'll start off here by specifying a version, and then we'll move on to specify our services. In this case, we'll have our client service. Within our client service, we'll want to specify a build, and that will have a context. The context in this case will be our root directory of our project. So that will specify to copy over from the root directory to the Docker container. Next, we'll specify a Dockerfile. We haven't made this yet, but we'll specify the path, and we'll make that shortly. Next, we'll add a container name, and in this case, it'll be client. Then we'll add our volumes. So we'll want two volumes here, one for our source and one for our node modules. The first one for our source will be obviously within the root. So then we'll bind mount that into a directory within the Docker container named user source app. So in app directory, an important piece here is that we want this to be rewritable so that any changes get picked up and copied over into Docker while we're modifying the code. Next, we'll want to specify a volume for our app node modules. So to do so, we'll specify a named volume, app node modules, and we'll bind mount this to our source directory within the container. So user source app node modules. And since that is a directory, we can denote that with a trailing slash. So you'll notice here that we've specified app node modules. This is meant to be a named volume. So what this does is when the Docker Compose command is run and a volume of the same name exists, data from that volume will be copied over into our container. If the named volume doesn't exist, then a new one will be created, which will contain a copy of the node modules from our installation, our npm install command essentially, that ran inside of our container. This way we can delete and recreate the container without having to also recreate the node modules each time, because it'll just pick it up from the volume. To do so, we'll specify our app node modules as a separate volume outside of our client service. And this will be an empty volume. This way, we ensure that any node modules installed within our container get placed into the volume. This is our target directory, and this is our source. Let's go ahead and create that Docker file here. So we'll make a new directory in the root of our project. New directory, and we'll say Docker. Then in there we'll make a Webpack directory, and we'll create a new file named Dockerfile. We'll add that. Alright. So within our Docker file, we're going to first want to specify our node image, because obviously we're running React. We have to run a distribution with Node. So say from node, and I know a lot of people use Alpine. That's fine. Again, this is only locally. We're not we're not launching a production app here, so it's fine if you want to use Alpine. But there are some disadvantages there. I think it's namely that it's not officially supported with Docker, so you might encounter some issues somewhere along the lines. In any case, you definitely want to have a smaller sized version, especially locally. So I'm just going to use LTS Bullseye Slim. The next thing we want to do is to set our working directory. Usually when you're setting this up locally, it's okay to you kind of can do what you want, but it's definitely a good idea not to use the root user. So we're going to switch over to switch over to a node user, and we're going to set our work directory to user source app. Next, we'll need to copy over our package.json files. So we'll just use the copy command, chown the node user, our package lock JSON, and package.json file. And we set our working directory to user source app. So these two files will be, so our current directory is now that work directory. So we can just copy these files into our current directory. Next, we'll run our installation. So we'll go npm CI. We're going to use this because npm CI, that is, because it uses the package lock file to install application dependencies, so you're less likely to have an issue or some corrupted packages. And then we will copy in an entry point file, which I'll explain in a minute. So we'll use our node user for that. We'll create an entry point shell file and store it in this exact location where we are right now, Docker Webpack, and we will copy that over into the Docker container. And we will need to set permissions on that file so that we can effectively execute it. And this will be an entry point file, so we'll need to specify it here. And it is in the root container, so the location is set there. And that's what a Dockerfile looks like. So when we run this, it will install a slimmed down version of a Debian system running Node. We're going to set the user to Node, set the working directory to user source app. We're going to copy in via the Node user our package files. We'll run the npm install command using continuous integration, and this will reference the package log file and install the dependencies through there. And then we'll copy over our entry point shell file, and we'll just make it executable, and then we'll specify that that is our entry point. So the next thing we'll want to do is actually create the entry point shell file, in which case we will create a new file here, name it entry point.shell, add it, and this is a shell file, so we'll need to specify that for our image as a shell script. Then we'll just specify npm run start. There's one final thing we need to do to wrap this all up. In order to allow access to the Docker container from our host machine or laptop, we need to create a port mapping so we can map the port from our local machine into the Docker container. To do so, we'll add a new ports key here, and we will map port 3000 on our host machine to port 3000 within the Docker container. Now it's time to actually create our container image and volume within Docker. To do so, we'll specify the docker compose command, and we'll say docker compose up because we want to start the containers, but before starting them we need to create them, so we need to build those containers out. And the last command -d will run it as a standalone daemon, so you don't have to keep this terminal up and running. In my case, I will need to use super user privileges to run this command. You can get around this by, I believe, adding privileges to the actual docker.sock file. Otherwise, you can just use the sudo command. So let's go ahead and start this up. I'll enter my password, and we'll let this run through. Now that everything is started up, we can pull over Docker desktop here, and we can see that it did create a Docker HTTPS example container, and our client is running on port 3000 on our host machine and mapped to port 3000 within the Docker container. We also have our image in use, and we've got our node modules volume created. And now if we go back to containers, you'll see under the ports section there's a link, so if we click that we can open up our application, and we'll pull that over and we can see here that it is running correctly. So we have successfully created a React application running within a Docker container. So if that wasn't exciting enough for you, part 2 of this series will explore setting up a local self-signed certificate so we can run HTTPS on our application locally. And then part 3 will go through hot module reloading and hooking that up while running React within a Docker container.